Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar series Transparency and Accountability in Public-Private Partnerships, jointly sponsored by the Leadership, Learning and Innovation Group and the Public-Private Partnerships Group of the World Bank. This webinar series will look at practices and ideas which seek to enhance transparency in PPP procurement and implementation, and will feature practitioners and policymakers from various countries and organizations. I'm Shyamala Shukla, Senior Consultant with the World Bank Group, Public-Private Partnerships. Today, in this first webinar in the new series, we will discuss the role of the Fairness Auditor in the PPP process with specific focus on the Canadian province of Alberta. The Fairness Auditor provides an important oversight function to the procurement process, ensuring that the process is fair to all bidders and evaluations are well informed and reasoned. Our guest speakers today are Syed Zaidi and Richard B. Innes. Syed is currently working as Director Strategic Partnerships with the Government of Alberta and Canada. He has over 2 decades of experience building project implementation strategies for infrastructure programs across sectors. Apart from his core technical expertise and background in civil engineering and a PhD with a research focus on PPPs, Syed has a deep understanding of what it takes to put together complex deals and contracts while interfacing with various stakeholders. Syed also leads a UNECE project related to certification of organizations in procurement standards. Incidentally, I work with him on this project. Richard B. Innes has worked as Fairness Auditor with the Government of Alberta in Canada for the last 7 years. He has long experience as a Fairness Auditor, and he's the right kind of person to be with us today. He has in-depth knowledge of government procurement and transparency and accountability issues in PPP. Richard has also had a long career in the private sector and has participated actively in the areas of corporate and project finance, mergers and acquisitions, corporate restructuring, and equity investments. Syed and Richard, a very warm welcome to both of you. With Syed and Richard, we have both sides of procurement represented. Often we have transaction advisors and contracting agencies within government lamenting the various transparency requirements and how they tend to delay projects. And on the other side, we have those responsible for ensuring fairness who emphasize the importance of spending some time to fulfill transparency requirements. And they say that it is well worth the time, and it is definitely going to result in better projects and happier stakeholders. So let us see the two sides of PPP procurement. Syed, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Shyamala. Welcome, everyone. My name is Syed Zaidi, and as Shyamala said, I'm with the Government of Alberta over here, and I'm working on major P3 projects with them. So we are going to talk about Fairness Auditor today. Just an overview of what we are going to discuss today is fundamentally is the introduction of Fairness Auditor, what's the role of Fairness Auditor, and some overview of PPP Procurement Process in Alberta, Canada, how we do PPPs here, just an overview, and role of Fairness Auditor and the required services. What is the exact role of Fairness Auditor, and some concluding remarks. So just to start on the discussion, just to give you some context, there are three in Alberta or in Canada or in any P3s, there are three fundamental principles for PPP procurement. That it has to be fair, open, and transparent. That's the fundamental. If you compromise on any one of them, then your whole deal goes sideways and you don't have any credibility of the deal. So that's fundamental, that your procurement should be fair, open, and transparent. Then there are few principles and guidelines around PPP procurement process. When you're doing a procurement, what are the three key things you have to be very mindful of? First is the confidentiality of information. All these proponents, they share you their business-related information, their technical submissions, and all those things. So we have to be very careful that we don't compromise on the confidentiality of the information and everything is managed in the right way. Then at the same time, when as you know, that PPP procurement, they take a long time, and sometimes these whole process can take up to 1 year or 1.5 years, depending upon the type of procurement and the sector you are dealing with. It's important that you have schedule certainty, because all these PPP procurements are basically big consortium, and they have other business opportunities to pursue. So we have to be very careful that whatever we are committing from time perspective, we honor that. In case of Alberta, when we are doing P3, at the very start of the project, we identify around 30 to 40 key milestones when we are going to issue RFQ document, request for qualification, when we are going to complete our shortlisting of the proponents, when we are going to announce the shortlisting, when we are going to issue the RFP document, when we are going to have technical submissions or technical meeting with the proponents, and when we are going to have agreement meetings, when we are going to complete our evaluation, when we are going to sign the contract. All those key milestones we identify at the very start of the project, so that the proponents, they are aware of the schedule of the project and they can align their resources accordingly. And so far in all our deals, we have been very particular about it, that we follow that timelines and we strictly adhere to it. That's fundamental, so that people understand the sensitivity of the project and sensitivity of the schedule. Third important thing is the process integrity. Whatever rules you have laid down for the procurement, we have to make sure as an owner, as a government, that we stick to them and we don't change the rules for any particular entity or particular party, and there is no bias in the process. So the process it should have its integrity. And that's the fundamental area where the role of Fairness Auditor is key, because that role brings in the integrity to the process. So moving to next slide. So fairness in PPP context. What are the 4 key things that we have to consider when we are looking for fairness in PPP context? The first is that the government follows the process set out in the request for qualification or request for proposal documents or in the process. Whatever we say, what will be our evaluation criteria, how we are going to shortlist the process, what will be your basis of award the contract, and all those things, they have to lay it down first, and we follow the process. Then we have to identify in our document what will be the evaluation criteria, how we are going to proceed with the evaluation. So all those things are very, very well defined in the process, in the document, and the proponents, the P3 companies or P3 proponents, they understand how they're going to be judged and what will be the basis of award of the contract. So they can align their resources, they can align their qualification, they can align their technical submissions accordingly. And the third thing is that we have to make sure as a government that there is no favoritism. We are not favoring any entity, because that can jeopardize the whole process. And this is another area where the role of Fairness Auditor is key. That the Fairness Auditor has to make sure that the government is not doing any favoritism or not bringing any sort of bias that goes into the favor of any one entity. And the fourth one is that we treat all the proponents, all the P3 parties, in a fair, consistent manner and throughout the process. So those are the 4 key, you can say, principles or 3 things that we have to follow in P3 that brings in the fairness in P3 context. Key considerations of Fairness Auditor. In Alberta, we have what we call a document of what we call the Alberta P3 Framework and Guidelines. Sorry, I have to move the slide. Yeah. So it is mandated that for all P3 projects, we have a Fairness Auditor. And the role of Fairness Auditor is defined in that document. So basically, for any P3s in Alberta and in most of the Canada, we need to have a Fairness Auditor during the procurement process. So the Fairness Auditor is retained by the government, but it is not that we just go out and just select any individual. It is an open competitive process. So the fairness starts from the openness and competitive process for selecting Fairness Auditor. The purpose is that the start of the process should be open and transparent. So we don't bring in somebody who is aligned with us or who can take care of our interest in the process. We want to bring in Fairness Auditor whose interest is to follow the process and give an oversight to the government that we are following the process. So the Fairness Auditor, in Alberta, what we have an overall top executive team. This team overlooks the project team, and it provides them advice and guidelines during the P3 procurement process. The Fairness Auditor reports to this oversight committee, and he is basically monitoring the project team, and at the same time he is a resource available to the PPP proponents who are in the process. So basically, it is retained by the government, but the Fairness Auditor is reporting to a senior level oversight committee. So, three things about key consideration about Fairness Auditor: that he has to be, or he or she has to be independent of the government. A government employee cannot be a Fairness Auditor. So he has to be an outside entity, outside the government. And we have to retain Fairness Auditor at the very start of the process, at the very start of the procurement. When we announce the project, the recommended approach is that when you announce the project, you retain the Fairness Auditor. But he has to be on board before we issue the request for qualification. And the third most important thing is that he must have a professional designation, like chartered accountant, professional engineer, or a lawyer. I mean, the individual must have some sort of credibility on his own. So we have to make sure that a person who has got no professional designation is not retained as a Fairness Auditor. They must have some sort of qualifications. Those are the fundamental things we need for Fairness Auditor. Next is overview of the procurement process. I won't go in detail of every task listed here, but these are some of the key tasks during the procurement process in P3s we do in Alberta or in Canada. As you can see, the overall procurement period can take up to a year or a year and a half. So basically, during this whole period, we retain Fairness Auditor. And if you see in the first column, in red, it shows hire Fairness Auditor. This is at the very start of the project. As soon as we announce the project, the intent is to hire the Fairness Auditor so that he can give you that oversight from the very start of the process. And he can monitor the fairness, integrity of the process from the very beginning. He basically, Richard is going to talk about it. So at each phase, how his role becomes very critical and what type of oversight he is provided. So I'm not going to go into the details, but if you have any questions regarding this process, we can come back to it and I can answer to those. But the important point over here is that we have to retain Fairness Auditor at the very start of the process. Next one is the role of Fairness Auditor in general. And again, Richard is going to talk more about it, but I will give you an overview. What is the general role of the Fairness Auditor? He has to make sure that government adheres to the process set out in the procurement documents, and which are fundamentally request for qualification and request for proposal documents. So we outline what is the process, what are the requirements. So the government has to follow all those things fundamentally. Second thing is that evaluation criteria and procedure are well defined and applied in accordance. So he has to make sure that all the evaluation criteria are defined. If anything is missing, he has to bring in our attention and we have to fix that problem if there is any. And third point, again, coming back to my earlier point, that all our process and outcomes are not influenced by any biases. That's the fundamental thing. And all the proponents are treated fairly and consistently throughout the process. And at the same time, another role is he has to give advice to the government. If we are missing anything, if there is anything that flags, that gives them some red flags regarding the process or the fairness of the process or integrity of the process, he identifies those sort of things to the government so that we can fix the issue or problem that can question the integrity of the process. And the last one is that the Fairness Auditor issues the reports. We know it's a gated process, like from RFQ to RFP. At every gate, Fairness Auditor issues a report that this RFQ or request for qualification or qualification process was taken care of. It was a due process, and we followed all the required obligations. So at the end of each process, till the signing of the contract, the Fairness Auditor issues the report to the government. So these are the key roles of the Fairness Auditor. Now, one thing that is critical, I must disclose over here. The role of Fairness Auditor does not delay the process. Rather, his role complements the process. So there is no, people can, sometimes there is a myth out there that somehow this third-party entities may delay the process. No, that's not the case. Rather, it streamlines the process. And in some cases, you can say, in some cases, it may fast-track the process. Because if you have an issue and you don't have any such entity over there, then there may be an issue that government may be struggling to come up with a response or something. So if you have a third party over there, so it's good to have that insight and oversight, and it complements the process. So that's fundamental. That role of Fairness Auditor is to complement the process, and it's not to delay the process. So now I'm going to hand over to Richard Ennis to take over the presentation from here. And Richard has been with us for all as a Fairness Auditor on all major projects in Alberta. So I think he's the right person to take on discussion from here. Over to you, Richard.
Richard, before you take over, I just wanted to point out, try not to disturb the microphone in front of you. It's causing a little bit of a disturbance, like whenever you move it. So be careful about that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Syed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As identified earlier, I'm a chartered accountant by background and have been Fairness Auditor for 7 years, with applying each time through the RFP process and being successful to be the Fairness Auditor for Alberta. The first slide really talks about the framework, which Syed covered in detail. The Fairness Auditor is used throughout Canada, and the role is being more and more accepted. I was involved not only with the government, but was asked to do a fairness review for the City of Edmonton for a procurement of major office space, and applied that to a tender process, which wasn't really a public-private partnership. So other people are using the Fairness Auditor skill set. You go to the next slide. The RFQ phase, basically I'm involved right from the documentation, through all the meetings, through all the questions, and throughout the process. So in the RFQ, in the documents, I'm looking that there is a clear set of instructions, that there's no preferences. For example, the RFQ should be open to everyone. There shouldn't be a pre-requirement for just doing business in Alberta, for example, or having white trucks with blue lettering. No preferences set out in those documents. The evaluation criteria should be clear to the proponents so they know what they have to provide and how they're going to be scored on that information. Typically in the RFQ, there's 4 sections: project lead, design and construction, maintenance and repair, and finance, that are each given scores by a team of individuals. What I do typically at the beginning, we have a kickoff meeting, and in that meeting, I identified the individuals, some of whom are new to the process, that they need to look at the documents provided by each respondent, that they need to go through the detail against the scoring criteria as though it was the only person in the game, and not use biases that they may have come across in their work with the various contractors in scoring, making the scoring decisions. The next part really is they all break up, look at the documents from each respondent, and individually come up with a score for each segment. The scores are aggregated, and they come to an agreement on what the score will be for that segment. Then that's challenged again. So the process is very robust, and I sit through that process, and if there's any fairness concerns, people are not understanding or whatever, we can have that discussion and make sure that that process is robust and fair. So the score is created. Assuming 5 respondents come in, we're shrinking it down to 3 proponents. So 2 people have the lower scores. We feel those need to have been done in a fair way, and I end up having to comment on that. But then we get into a debrief for the 2 unsuccessful people, and those debriefs have to be fair as well. So we may share ranking, but we do not share information from the other proponents. So again, fairness across the board, not only with those that stay in the process, but those that are eliminated. If you move to the next slide. The RFP phase, basically we're down to 3 proponents now. There's a large document issued called Instructions to Proponents, which sets out all the steps that they're going to have to follow, sets out the schedule, and has a number of general rules, one of which allows them to come to the Fairness Auditor for a formal opinion, and I need to respond within 5 days to speak to Zayad's comment on speed. And so those kinds of, that document, plus the actual contract itself, the draft contract, are fairly comprehensive. And as Fairness Auditor, I need to really understand those documents and make sure that I am satisfied with the fairness of the process and am set up to follow and have people comply with that. There are meetings on the documents. There are meetings, technical meetings on the actual project components. And what I do is sit through all those meetings. And at the end of those meetings, I ask whether the process has been fair to this point in time. So what I'm doing is managing the fairness process, each meeting, each step of the way, so that if anybody's got any concerns, any of the proponents, those concerns can be brought to the table quickly and dealt with right away. We've had situations, I'll give you 2 examples. We had a conflict situation where the project director had 2 cousins working for one of the proponents. I had not seen those cousins for 10 years. They were in senior positions with the proponent in another country. What we did there, from a fairness point of view, was met with the other proponents. So the one proponent that was the project manager was related to, we met, myself and the project manager, met with the other 2 proponents and said, are you okay with the project manager continuing on the job? So that's one example of a bias that we eliminated. So those are the kinds of things that we deal with as we go along. The other thing is that all communication needs to be in writing, and the Fairness Auditor needs to be copied on that. So there can't be sort of side conversations or conversations going on that may be biased because of relationships in the past and so on. In the technical submission, Often the technical submission is short of components that are required, and those are called compliance issues. As Fairness Auditor, I need to make sure that all major compliance issues are cleared up on each technical submission to make sure that they will fit the bill if, in fact, that party, that proponent, wins the contract. What happens on the proponents each put in a net present or a series of economic numbers that come to a net present value, the capital that they're going to need, the maintenance money they're going to need. It creates a net present value, and the lowest net present value in the case of Alberta wins the contract. So it's a straight mathematical thing, but again, I sit in on that process and make sure that the process for doing the math is robust, that there's qualified people checking it, and that the proper result is achieved. Next slide. So working with the project team over the whole process is typically there are team meetings, project meetings, deputy minister meetings, and so on. I sit in on every meeting because I find that just general discussion a fairness audit or a fairness issue can be identified just through general discussion, and it's easy to deal with that issue when it's being formulated in people's minds rather than when a decision has been made that I would potentially find to be unfair. So that's the right place to deal with that. In the agenda for the team meetings, the last item, I asked that the last item be a check with me as to fairness, and I sign off on each meeting that there are or are not fairness issues that need to be dealt with. Occasionally there's a fairness issue, and it has to be dealt with prior to the next meeting. So again, we're moving the thing along right with the team to keep the fairness activity complementary and not a drag on the process. Again, you get copies of the minutes and the documents to make sure that things that were said in the meeting are in fact reflected properly in the documents, which are subject to audit at a later time. Next slide. So what happens is the Fairness Auditor role, in some cases, had stopped at the end of the choice of a successful proponent. But I found that I carry on the fairness role right through to close. We had a situation where after the successful proponent was chosen, they came forth with a financial alternative that they felt was good for the province and for the proponent. And I had to unfortunately suggest that had that been known before the bids were in, that others might have been bid differently, so it would be unfair to make any changes. In the first P3 I was involved in, the closing happened in September of 2008. We were closing in the week ending September 12th. The closing took all week, back and forth with 9 banks involved. The contract closed on the Friday. Lehman Brothers went down on the weekend. Had the thing taken another week, we would have had a very serious issue with being able to close, and consequently a question of fairness as to whether those people would be eliminated, we would move to the second bidder, etc. So it's important that the fairness auditor be involved right through the final close and the actual deal being done. If you move to the next slide, the reporting, what I've found is some jurisdictions, the fairness reports are lengthy. One out of one jurisdiction was 14 pages, for example. I've kept the reports. The reports here in Alberta have been fairly simple, 2-3 pages. Fundamentally, you're talking about what your role was, what you have done to achieve that role, and then you need to be very simply clear on your opinion that there is that the process was consistent, that there was no bias during the process, and that the process was fair. The other thing is that there should be no surprises in that report. If you're going to put anything into the report other than just a clean opinion, people should have known about ahead of time. You should have given them a chance to vet what you're proposing to say, and so that you aren't catching people off guard. There was a situation in Ontario where a scathing report was issued with no prior knowledge of the fact that the Fairness Auditor had problems, and it was a very bad situation. So that basically concludes my comments. And if we go to the last slide, I think we're talking about the four elements, basically. My role provides integrity. I have not been involved at all with government. In order to avoid bias of any kind, I had to sell some shares in a construction company before starting my role way back in time. The PPP proponents have been comfortable and have written to the government suggesting that my role was a good comfort to them, and I presume it enhances the government's credibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Syed and Richard. We will now open the session for questions. As you can see in the chat box, there are a number of questions, and we have also received some questions in advance. So we will try to go through as many of them as possible. Let's begin with a basic question which Richard Mugo has asked. He sent this question in advance. Does the Fairness Auditor mechanism need to be underpinned in law or regulation for it to be effective, recognizable judicially?
I think in case of Alberta and most of the Canadian jurisdiction, it is not a law, but it is part of a P3 framework and guidelines. And those guidelines mandate us to use the Fairness Auditor for our P3 procurements. I think the fundamental principle as a law is that you have to be open, transparent, and fair to all the proponents. And just to make sure that we are complying with that requirement, we need to bring a third party to make sure that government is playing its due role in that thing.
Yes, I don't. There is no law. That's the question.
And to go to other questions, other discussions that our participants have been having in the chat box, a lot of discussion has taken place on the independence and conflict of interest issues. Richard, you talked quite a bit and gave a few examples on conflict of interest. And on independence, we have some of our participants talking about how the auditor is chosen. You have talked about that too. Who pays one of the questions is from Marcos. He asks, who pays the, Fairness Auditor? And then there's another related question. Anand Srivastav is asking, has a cost-benefit analysis ever been done? And does the presence of the Fairness Auditor, the fact that you have to pay someone to be Fairness Auditor, do the procurement process to select the Fairness Auditor, does it add to the costs? It obviously does a little bit. Yep. So is it worth it? So that's the kind of question. So one side is the independence, and the second is whether we should go in for those extra costs.
I'll let you speak to the costs.
Okay. Two things. First thing is that the Fairness Auditor is retained by the government through an open procurement process. So we put a request for proposal out in public, and then we get the submissions, and we outline all the scope of services and whatever are the qualification requirements. Based on those qualification and scope of services, we do selection of the Fairness Auditor. Fairness Auditor, the government pays to the Fairness Auditor. So it's not that proponents are also paying for it. It's only the government who's paying for it. But one thing that is critical is that Fairness Auditor is not reporting to the project team or project director. Fairness Auditor is reporting to the high level of government executive committee or an oversight committee. So whatever his observations are or advice are, he gives it to the senior management oversight committee. At the same time, he is involved from the oversight perspective, from monitoring perspective to the team. So he's available as a resource to the team. And the third question was
about my independence. Yeah. Basically, prior to becoming Fairness Auditor, I had no involvement with government in my past career. When I was hired, as I mentioned, I had some shares in a construction company. I had to sell those or chose to sell those to avoid any potential conflict or perceived conflict. I have made sure that while I've had an association with individuals here for 7 years, that there is no personal contact outside my government meetings with those individuals, nor with any of the proponents or their team members. My background as a CA is one thing that is very key as a chartered accountant is your level of integrity, and I take that very seriously. So those are my comments about independence and my maintenance of that.
Coming back to Anand's question for the value of or the cost of Fairness Auditor, we do consider the cost. There is a cost to the government, but it's looking at the big picture, it's not significant. And when we are doing value for money analysis and all those sort of things, those costs are reflected in our value for money reports, how much we pay to each of our advisor or the consultants, or even which includes the cost of Fairness Auditor. So we never did a cost benefit analysis, or we do not assign a cost to the fairness. I mean, whatever the cost is, we have to pay it. So that's a business decision we have to make. But our fundamental objective is to make sure that the process is there and integrity is there. So we don't assign cost to the integrity and fairness of the process, you can say.
There's lots of other questions on the independence. Shona Banda is asking, how is the Fairness Auditor considered independent when he's part of the selection process? He may not be able to see weaknesses or loopholes he has been part of in the making. So it's a question of, while being a part of the selection process, how can the Fairness Auditor maintain his, a separation where he's able to see the problems with the process?
That's a very good question. I cannot be part of the process because I'm expressing an opinion on the process. So I am observing the process. I'm looking at the process and determining if there are any fairness issues. And if I see a fairness issue, I identify that there is an issue, but I do not provide the answer. I've run into situations where it appears something is going to become unfair. My question then is, do you feel, if you're asking me if you think it's fair, you better go back and take another look at it, for example. So it's very key that I do not recommend solutions, that my involvement does not change it can make the process fairer, but I do not add to the process.
Thank you, Richard. We have a couple of other questions on the usefulness or the additionality of having a fairness auditor. Richard Mungo again is asking, in jurisdictions like Kenya, there's a public procurement oversight board, there's an appeals board, and these are there in some other jurisdictions as well, or there's a court system which is available, if not specific boards. So what would be the benefit of having a fairness auditor in what is the additionality?
I think first of all, whatever is your procurement process or guidelines, you have to identify the role of fairness auditor. And again, as Richard said, the role of fairness auditor is not to be part of evaluation process, but he has to give an oversight. He has to monitor the process. So it's like auditing. So it's the auditing of the process. It's not being part of the process. It's a different thing. It's an oversight. So I think in any procurement, any complex procurements like P3s, it's a recommended approach that you make role of fairness auditor as part of your guidelines and framework, and then you identify the role and what is the reporting structure, how you're going to retain a fairness auditor, who is going to pay for it, and all those sort of things. But the fundamental is that it has to be at arm's length from the project team, because he has to be separate from the project team, but he has to provide a report to some senior executive level group in the organization or in the government.
The other comment for the person from Kenya is it sounds like there's two bodies that are providing an oversight. But I guess my question would be, is that oversight provided while the procurement is happening, or is it after the procurement has occurred and there's some challenge to it? The benefit of my being part of the process is that the fairness decision is made virtually at the time of closing. My reports have typically been issued within 2 or 3 days of the closing.
Very important point, Richard, and I see that one of the participants, Dishan, has already mentioned that, because procurement oversight boards and appeals tribunals, he says, mainly adopt a feedback review approach. They come after, while the fairness auditor is a very simultaneous process which can look at problems while they are going on and point those out, and therefore ensure a better process without delays and all the delays that you associate with oversight boards or appeals tribunals. Those don't happen here. So that's a very important point and a major advantage of having a fairness auditor. There's another very specific question from Anand. He asks, is the FA mechanism used for, the fairness auditor mechanism used for all sizes of PPP? Is there a threshold of in terms of transaction size, or you just do it irrespective of whatever the size of the transaction?
No, it doesn't matter what size of the transaction it is. It is mandated for all P3s, especially in Alberta. But I know in most of the other jurisdictions, also in Canada, it's the same thing. But in Alberta, it is for whether it's a $10 million P3 or $100 million P3 or $1 billion P3. Fairness auditor has to be there.
And the process basically doesn't change.
Yeah, process is exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. And there's another question from Marcos. Richard, this is basically to you. Have you ever had the experience where your recommendations have not been implemented because the government disregarded those? Does it often happen that a fairness auditor has a particular view and thinks that there are problems in the process, but the government doesn't correct it, or the team which is doing the procurement doesn't correct it? Have there been such situations?
I have not run into that specifically, but the result would be, it would be identified in the report as a breach of fairness, and that would create a difficult situation, I believe. I've found that in the roles I've played here that the team is very conscious of fairness. I'll use an example. We had 3 proponent meetings over 3 days. We served lunch sandwiches for 2 days, and they came to me to ask if it would be fair to have some hot food on the third day. So they take fairness very seriously here. I did not express an opinion on lunch, but to answer the question, I've not run into a situation where if I saw a fairness issue, that it wasn't taken seriously and corrected to my satisfaction.
And just to add to Richard's point, Fairness Auditor report, at the end of the project, we issue a value for money report, which is a public document, and Fairness Auditor report is part of that value for money report. So it is a public information. So we make everything, all the thing that is from Fairness Auditor, it can be public. And we have a law in Canada or an act in Canada, which is Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. Under that act, general public can have access to all those inside reports also. So it's not that something, if there is a negative report from Fairness Auditor, and it won't be a public, it will be public eventually, and it will have some consequences with the government.
What might be useful to your listeners is they can go and see an example of my fairness reports on infrastructurealberta.ca under strategic partnerships, which is in the banner at the top of the website. Go to P3 projects, Alberta schools, and value for money reports is inside that.
Thank you, Richard. That's very useful. There was a question on the links to Fairness Auditor reports. You've answered it even before we asked it. Thank you so much. And there's another related question. This time it is for Syed. Anand is asking about the Fairness Auditor sitting with the Evaluation Committee meetings, and does the Evaluation Committee take it as an interference in their job? As Syed, you have led a lot of transactions, a number of transactions in Alberta.
No.
Have you ever seen this happening?
Yeah, we don't consider it as an interference. Fairness Auditor has got all the liberty to go in any meeting, and he can oversee any evaluation, any meeting. So we cannot mandate him or restrict him from participating in anything. But as Richard said, he's not part of evaluation team. He's not evaluating. He's not assigning scores or marks to the teams or proponents. But he's overseeing the process. Are we following the process? Whatever the rules we are following, are they clear up front? And are we applying consistently to all the P3 proponents or all the stakeholders over there? So that's fundamental. So we don't consider it as an interference.
Yeah, I have been reading about the role of the Fairness Auditor in Alberta, other provinces of Canada, and I think he does not give technical, legal, or financial input into the project process that is happening, but looks more at the process, the fairness, and whether everything is being followed.
Right.
So yeah, there's another question. Vishnu Basant from the World Bank is asking whether the function of the Fairness Auditor can be extended to cover unsolicited bids or situations where knowledge and expertise is proprietary. So do you have unsolicited bids in Alberta, and how do you deal with those? Do you have Fairness Auditors for those?
No, we don't have unsolicited proposals, or we don't allow that so far. But at some point, as you know, internationally, this is a new trend that's coming up. So we have to, if we go that route, we have to develop some guidelines. But in either case, the role of Fairness Auditor will be there. So that's fundamental. But we have to see, like if it is an unsolicited proposal, then we have to come up with some new guidelines for those things. But right now, as Richard mentioned, the role of Fairness Auditor is expanding to non-P3 projects also in Canada. And there are examples over here in Canada where we have retained, rather in our ministry also, we have used the role of Fairness Auditor on a non-P3 project, and in the similar context. Yeah. You want to add?
Sorry, no. I spoke, I think, of the city project that I was asked to come in and take an overview of the fairness and the process. And that was just a straight tender with 13 bidders.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard and Sayed. We are coming to the close of the session. We have just 9 minutes more. And before we close this session, I would like each of you, Richard and Sayed, to take exactly 1 minute to respond to one last question. What would you like the audience to take away as the key message from the Alberta experience related to PPP procurement and the role of fairness auditors? One key message from each of you. Sayed, you in your role as the director managing a number of projects, and Richard, you in your role as the fairness auditor on some of these very major projects.
I think the fundamental is that role of fairness auditor is very critical in any complex procurement, not only P3s. In P3s, it has got more requirement. You can say it's more essential for P3s. But from government perspective, it provides, as mentioned in the last slide, that it provides integrity to the procurement process. That's fundamental. And from the government perspective, it enhances the credibility of the government also, that we are running a fair and open and transparent process. And it's not only good for that individual deal we are pursuing, but it enhances your credibility for your future P3 procurements also.
From my perspective, the key element that I've found is to be in attendance, be obvious, be available, attend and listen to discussion, to ensure that fairness issues are dealt with as soon as possible before they become an issue, and make sure that there's open communication with all segments of the process, so that people who have any concerns can feel comfortable about bringing them to the fairness auditor during the process.
Thank you so much, Richard. There are a few other questions which we will basically not be taking. For some, I think we do not have information of that kind. In the last couple of years, the World Bank itself has been doing reviews of various jurisdictions to look at transparency and accountability practices. Mujtaba Shanil, who's a participant today, he has sent in an earlier question, and he's also asking another question here. This is on the reduction in litigation and dispute risk as a part of the procurement risk in projects. And there have been other questions as we have conducted consultations with governments on these issues. Increasingly and repeatedly, we have this question about, can such practices, for example, the practice of having a fairness auditor, for example, having the practice of disclosing certain elements of information from time to time at key milestones in the procurement process, and disclosing information post-procurement during the operational phase of the project, do all of these practices result in better projects, better services, and better value for money for the government? These are questions which are coming up, and I have not seen any scientific study which really points to disclosure resulting in better projects in PPPs, but there have been a lot of studies elsewhere in terms of public procurement, procurement of public infrastructure, which is totally invested by the public authority. And there have been other studies in governance. There have been studies by the cost And there have been open governance studies which indicate that more transparency and better governance results in better services to the people. And it also results in a more satisfied stakeholder population. So these are issues we are looking at, and we are trying to grapple with the issue of what would be the optimum level of transparency to have in PPP projects, so that we don't delay projects, but at the same time we ensure that it is fair to all the stakeholders involved, not just the bidders, but the services that are provided and the fiscal costs. It is fair to everyone who's involved, the taxpayer, not to say the least. Syed and Richard, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure, and I hope the audience enjoyed the discussion. I would like to thank everyone who listened in from all over the world and those who joined from the World Bank and Washington, D.C. Please do give us your feedback on the session and how we can work to improve these discussions. You will see the feedback screen on your computers in a little while from now. And also, please do not forget to join our next session in the series on May 12th, which will present a framework for disclosure in public-private partnerships based on reviews of country practices and consultations and technical work in disclosure with client countries. This framework will be in draft state. It is in draft stage right now, and we would like your feedback to make it better, as we also look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you so much for participating today.